Peter Jennings, thank you very much for joining me. Is the incoming government, whoever that may be after September 7, really equipped right now for the challenges that may lay ahead in its first term?
I think there are some very worrying areas where neither party is going to be particularly well equipped after the election. Foreign Affairs is one of those. We see a Foreign Affairs Department which has been systematically gutted of resources over the last 15 years or so.
And similar to so of defence.
Well, defence has actually done reasonably well in terms of government funding, I guess, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, but it's had a lot of resources cut in the last 24, 36 months. It's been estimated by my colleague Mark Thompson at ASPI at about $30 billion, which has been cut from planning. And so with defence, what we've got is a mismatch between very ambitious acquisition plans but a shrinking budget, and the two simply don't fit together.
When you look at our priorities in the region, is there a case that we may be too, if you look at foreign policy for instance, too Asia focused, that we're ignoring some of the other challenges throughout the rest of the world and the impact on Australia?
Well, Asia, of course, is always going to be a very high priority for Australia. Geography makes it that way. But the concern that I have is that at the moment our policy settings, the Asian Century White Paper, basically put almost exclusive priority on the five major countries in Asia. Now that's not enough to produce a foreign policy for a country with global interests like Australia. We need to have interests in the Pacific, in Europe, in Africa, even in Latin America. And at a point when the Department of Foreign Affairs is so starved of resources, if all they're really doing is giving priority to the 5 big Asian countries, we're going to miss out on a lot of important economic opportunities and a lot of important strategic developments which are taking place on a bigger canvas.
And so much of that policy is based around the US-China rivalry and a belief, a faith that ultimately that will be resolved positively, that the two can coexist in the region. Do you see it that way?
Well, it's a bet, and really the point here is not to try to make a judgment about which is more likely between conflict versus cooperation. You know, what we need is an Australian policy which is going to look after our interests regardless of which of those two outcomes we see in the future. At the moment, I think the government is taking a rather glass half full approach. Conveniently for the current government, that also means that it can explain why defence expenditure has been cut over the last few years. But we just need to have a more sophisticated policy that kind of acknowledges the fact that whether we face further cooperation or indeed conflict in the future, we've got to be able to deal with either of those outcomes.
And right now, given at the level of our defence spending, and also some have criticised Australia for essentially outsourcing a lot of its defence responsibilities to the United States in the region, do you believe that we're ill-equipped to deal with what some of the potential threats and challenges may be?
I think there's a very big risk that the thought is a big peace dividend can be taken after our forces return from Afghanistan and East Timor. The historical record shows that's precisely the wrong moment to take spending from the Defence Department. And I think we're starting to hear more clearly from our American friends too that they think we're free riding. We're actually just coasting too much on America's invested effort in defence. That's something that America these days is just not going to be prepared to tolerate. And so I think in order to be a credible alliance partner, we need to be prepared to spend more on defence than we currently are spending.
And where does the threat potentially lie?
There's no country which presents, I think, a threat to the mainland of Australia, Stan. Really what we need to be worried about at the moment is the potential for instability in Asia to lead to conflict between the major powers or indeed between some of the smaller powers. So I'd look at the South China Sea, where we have a number of very complicated competing claims for sovereign ownership of bits of territory. That might not directly threaten Australia, but if the region finds itself in the middle of a serious dispute, possibly caused by an incident at sea, that is just going to freeze our international environment and create a very complicated situation for Australia.
And of course, there are potential threats to Australia, although not, as you say, coming from any particular country in the region. But one area is cybersecurity. We know the United States is certainly, that's been in the news there in many different forms over the past year. Is it something that Australia has underestimated?
I think several years ago we started a good level of investment in cybersecurity, but what we have not been able to do is to respond to the incredibly fast change of pace in cyber matters. You know, the nature of cyber attacks can change quite easily in a 12-month period. And what's becoming clear is that even deeper investment is needed to protect the Australian economic infrastructure, to protect governments, even to protect the interests of individuals that may be using the internet for business or for shopping. And it's not something that we can afford to be relaxed about, because even countries that aren't as wealthy and as technologically advanced as we are have the capacity to develop quite sophisticated cyber capabilities to go after businesses and individuals.
Is the difficulty here too in cyberspace is that it's very difficult to exactly identify who is friend and who is foe. If we see the leaks coming from Edward Snowden, the extent to which American citizens are listened in on, the extent to which the United States spies on some of its allies. And we know, of course, about China's own involvement in that field as well. How difficult is it to be able to establish what the threat may be and where it may come from?
I don't think it's as difficult as that. I realise it's a bit of a hard sell, Stan, to make this point, particularly after a Snowden situation. But the fact of the matter is that the Western intelligence community is a very disciplined set of organisations operating openly within a set of very rigorous legal frameworks. Now, that's quite different from a number of other countries which might seek to do us harm. It's a complicated business, and what cyber does is it respects no geographic boundaries. It makes it possible for organised crime from Russia or Iran or semi-state-backed activities from China to all have an impact in terms of Australian commerce and Australian government sectors. And it can be very hard to attribute precisely where those attacks are coming from. But it seems to me that this is, as in all areas of security, offence and defence have marginal advantages from time to time. And what Australia needs to do is to make sure that we are absolutely the best in terms of our capacity to protect our economic infrastructure.
Peter, another area that you've touched on in your report is the need for Homeland Security to be able to guard against the impact, for instance, of terrorism in this country. How great a threat is that?
Well, I don't think we can assume that because there have been no terrorist attacks against our interests in the last few years, that isn't something which could come back onto the agenda very quickly. And we can't allow ourselves to be lulled into a false sense of security only to be surprised by the next attack which affects Australian interests. So it's one of these areas where, although we saw a significant investment of resources after the Bali bombings, this is not the moment now to assume that the problem has gone away. And indeed, as we look at our region, at Indonesia, for example, the nature of the terrorist threat may well be changing from a more organised Jemaah Islamiyah to individuals with the capability to act alone. But this is a threat which presents, I think, a clear risk to Australian interests. And we have to be prepared to take the steps and to make the investments necessary to ensure that our interests are protected, not only abroad but within Australian territory as well.
Just finally, Peter, turning to the economy, is Australia wrong to rely too much on nations like China and Japan to really protect our economic interests? Should we also be looking at diversifying that a lot now, particularly given what we've seen in Japan, a potential slowdown in China?
Stan, I think there's a risk that if we invest too heavily in what I call the big five Asian economies, the ones which are identified in the Asian Century White Paper, that we're not giving ourselves enough diversification to protect our interests. So in the case of those countries, well, we see that the Chinese economy is slowing down. The Japanese economy continues to be in stagnation, although picking up to some degree. South Korea is growing well, but it faces a constant risk from its northern neighbour. And then the two other countries which the white paper identifies are Indonesia, where we've never been particularly well invested in a business sense, and India, where our interests are rather narrow and where we've never succeeded in building as close a relationship as government would like. And they're the big five countries. Now, it seems to me that a more sensible approach would say, yes, they are critical to our interests, but we also need strategies which look at our ability to invest and benefit from emerging economies in Africa and the Middle East, and the very strong economies with whom we've always had good interests in Europe. And so I think a broader approach, one which recognises Australia's global interests rather than just regional interests, is a more sensible and protected strategy for Australia to adopt.
Yeah, certainly a lot to ponder in the report. Peter Jennings, thank you again for joining us here on Newsnight.
Thanks, Dan. It's a pleasure.